A very, very warm welcome to the 10th Strand Group, the signature seminar series of the Policy Institute at King's College London. You're all very welcome. Tonight, it is my very great pleasure to introduce Dame Margaret Hodge. MP for Barking, former chairman of the Public Accounts Committee and visiting professor of the Policy Institute here. Now, the Public Accounts Committee has a very long and illustrious history, as we all know, but I think, how can I put this? Margaret has had a somewhat more profound public impact than some of its other chairs. So without further ado, it is my very great pleasure, Dame Margaret Hodge, Memories of the Public Accounts Committee.
Thanks very much, John. I was worried I couldn't look over the podium, but I think you can just about see me over it. I do feel hugely privileged, actually, to be asked to be giving this lecture at King's College and the Public Policy Institute. And you won't know why, but I'm particularly thrilled because I was a creature of the 60s. So I'm afraid I completely messed up on my first degree. Too much time rocking and rolling, and too little time reading and studying. And I still have nightmares about it all. So this appointment provides me with a second chance, a wonderful second chance for rehabilitation, for which I am truly grateful. So thank you to the Policy Institute. Thank you to Jonathan Grant, who I see up there somewhere. Thank you to you, John. And I've got about 40 minutes or something, so I can't cover more than a few of the lessons I learned over the last 5 years and the matters I uncovered. So what I'm going to do is say a little bit about how we worked, cover briefly the general lessons, and then, because it's topical, I'm going to talk about tax and my take on the current issues. The very first thing that happened when I was elected as chair of the Public Accounts Committee was that I was instructed by the House of Commons officials that I'd have to move offices. And I just secured office in the modern portcullis house, close to all my political friends. And the last thing I wanted to do was leave them. But the moment I opened the doors on the room, I fell in love with it, and I abandoned all my pals, and the new room became my home. It's on the upper committee corridor in the House of Commons, overlooking the Thames. It's a Pugin-style wallpaper, and there's gilded sort of lettering above the door announcing the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee. I was the first woman. There are photos along all one side of the room of all my predecessors, and I started looking at who they were. 2 of them managed to get themselves assassinated, more than prime ministers, and I'm waiting for Google to have a little pop at me. 3 have been in prison. And they were all Labour MPs, but they were in prison for good causes. 2 of them were conscientious objectors, and 1 supported the suffragette movement. And the most famous, probably, of my predecessors was Harold Wilson. And his is an interesting story, because I couldn't work out what on earth he was doing on his way up in politics in becoming chair of the Public Accounts Committee. And then I learned that at his time, backbench MPs didn't have rooms in the House of Commons. They had those little desks with attached chairs in the corridors. And the only backbench opposition MP to get a room was the chair of the Public Accounts Committee. So he did simply take the job to get the room. And I'm told that in his day, there were renditions of the red flag on lots and lots of beer every evening. The Public Accounts Committee is the oldest of all the select committees. It was founded by Gladstone in 1861, and when he launched the committee, he thought its duties would be of a dry and repulsive kind. When I look back at 1861, at that time the budget was £69 million, equivalent to about 8 billion today. Today, we're looking at £700 billion of public expenditure. In 1861, the committee only met between December and March, and it only produced 1 report every year on the previous year's expenditure. We met between 2010 and 2015 twice a week, and we produced, and I'm really proud of this, 246 unanimous reports, with only one report that we didn't manage to get unanimity on, and that was the very controversial sale of the Royal Mail. But lots of what was happening then is the same today. So we uncovered two scandals, one in 1887, when the War Office signed a contract for ribbons for the army. And the contract was with a company called Davis and Co. And the previous contract had been with Thorpe and Son. And the previous contract had been for 14 shillings, and they signed the new contract for 20 shillings, 40% increase on the contract. The department refused to provide the information to the Controller and Auditor General and to the Public Accounts Committee, saying it was none of their business to enter upon matters of administration. I was reminded of David Cameron, who refused to provide our committee with any information on the aircraft carriers when he decided to change midstream the specification of the planes that he wanted on those carriers. And I was also reminded of Christopher Grayling, who refused to release statistics to us on the outcomes achieved from the £3 to £5 billion that he spent, that was spent on the work programme. My next story is about somebody called Colonel Buchan, who was at the Ministry of Information. And in 1920, he'd been asked to close down the ministry after the First World War. There was no need for any information anymore. And he approved personal payments to individuals totaling the sum of £101, 6 shillings and threepence. And that expenditure had not been authorised by Treasury. He paid one man £7 11 and sixpence simply to travel to London from his country retreat. And he paid two other men £35 in lieu of notice, although they'd been working abroad and had been being paid already for the work that they were doing. So it was double payment. A year later, and this is interesting, all the money was repaid by Colonel Buchan in full to the Treasury. I can't think of a Perm Secretary who's done that to date. It did remind me of the payoffs at the BBC, when Mark Byford, as Deputy Director General, walked away with £1 million. He already had an absurdly generous terms and conditions on redundancy, which would have given him £500,000, but they decided to give him £1 million because the Director General at that time, Mark Thompson, wanted to keep him focused on the job. The committee's always been chaired by a member of the opposition, but it reflects Parliament. So we had 5 Labour, 1 Lib Dem, and 7 Conservatives during my time. We really were a completely eclectic bunch of individuals, which is why it's so interesting that we managed to achieve unanimity. On the extreme right, I had Stuart Jackson, who is anti-immigration, anti-gay marriage, member of Conservative Voice. On my extreme left, I had Austin Mitchell, who'd been a founding member of the campaign group, and I didn't agree with either of them about Europe. It was a tribute really to all of us that we managed unanimous reports. And I think that was for a whole range of reasons. Partly, we were the first bunch of people to be elected. Before we got the job, the post was really in the gift of the leader of the parties and the whips. So that election gave us sort of autonomy and independence, which we valued, and I hope means that over coming time, select committees will continue to assert their independence. Our findings are always based on the facts. We had reports from the National Audit Office, and it's very difficult to argue with the facts when you are then interrogating whether it's permanent secretaries or others. And that's why, for example, we've produced extremely critical reports on areas of policy, really, which were absolutely dear at the core of the Conservative or coalition agenda, like the work programme, like universal credit, and still managed to secure unanimity on it. The other thing is we were supposed to always look backwards, not forwards. We weren't a policy formulating body. We were an analysis of whether executive action had been properly administered. Now, of course, that's a bit of an odd division, and we spent quite a lot of time commenting on policy and perhaps suggesting better policy directions in the future. But that whole emphasis on looking backwards made it much easier for us to secure unanimity. And I showed a willingness in the very early days when we were looking back at the record of the Labour government to criticise the Labour government. Indeed, one of our first reports was a report on a programme that I'd been partly responsible for as Employment Minister in the Department for Work and Pension, which was critical. It was an experiment we tried which hadn't worked. Our powers are terribly limited. All we can do is invite people to come and give evidence to us. Now, they can turn us down, and on a few occasions they did. And if that happens, I then issued a letter on a piece of A4 instructing them that they had to come. And I was very nervous with this order to attend, because I didn't know what the sanctions were behind it. So when I asked my clerk, well, what would happen if they simply ignored the letter, I was told that my ultimate sanction was to actually ensure that they spent a little while contemplating their misdemeanours in the Tower of London. Apparently nobody was put in the Tower of London since the 1880s. But because our power was limited, for that reason, we had to capture the headlines to stimulate a debate. So for some people, I was accused of grandstanding, but we needed to use the theatre of the committee actually to draw attention to the very, very important issues that we were raising. So when we did do this theatrical stuff that would then appear on the news or in the headlines in the papers, it was actually to a purpose. It wasn't simply theatre and grandstanding for its own sake. And our task was to follow the taxpayer's pound. And that in today's world means it goes in huge directions. Gone are the days when you had big departments and big contracts. You've now got a very fragmented public sector. And you've also got over half of public services delivered by private and voluntary companies. If you think of academy schools, free schools, welfare services, all those now probation services, all that has been now outsourced. So following the taxpayer's pound into this very much more fragmented tapestry was really very hard. But it made for a fantastically interesting period and a real good learning period for all of us. 1 week we'd be doing Ebola on one day, Peterborough hospitals on another day, Sellafield and the cost of dealing with getting rid of the contaminated nuclear waste, or learning disabilities on another day, defence procurement one day, or the wrongdoings in an academy primary school on another day. Not all our reports were critical, though you might think otherwise. We did do good reports, for example, on Crossrail, on troubled families, on even things like renewing the prison estate. And the story I always tell is one that about 16, welcome, about people from 16 to 19, where we did a report on FE. And we basically said things aren't going so badly. Bit of room for improvement, but actually we're quite pleased with progress. I get a phone call from a researcher on the Today programme who says, will you come on tomorrow morning? I say, fine. She says, what are you going to say? I said, well, I'm going to be quite complimentary, although I will have some recommendations for improvement. She said, I thought you were going to be critical. I said, no, it's a good report. She said, I'd better go away and read it. And then came back 20 minutes later and dumped me. Now, I want to do some reflections on the broad areas of what we saw, the sort of key things that I came away with, and then talk about tax. The first really was the sheer extent of mind-boggling, unconscionable waste that there is in public expenditure. And even though I'd been a minister for 12 years and I'd been active in public, as a public servant for 40 years, I was shocked by the extent of the waste. I always tell the story of one hearing we had one afternoon on the Ministry of Defence key procurement projects. And literally in a 2.5 hour session, we identified about £8 billion of expenditure which had been completely wasted, either through projects being delayed, being abandoned, specifications being changed, but it was like tearing up pound notes and throwing them away as confetti. And one of the worst stories, a Labour story, was the aircraft carriers. This was a decision taken in 1998 by the Labour government to replace the Invincible carriers with 2 new aircraft carriers. It took them 10 years to get to the point where they might have let a contract. By 2007 and 8, they were ready to do that. There was no money in the budget, but Gordon Brown, for industrial reasons, wanted us to go ahead with the contract. He wanted to conserve the jobs up in Rosyth. So it was not a defence purpose, but it was a jobs and industrial purpose that was the influence in going ahead with that. So they let a contract. By that time, 10 years had passed, so the costs had gone up from 2.8 billion to 3.65 billion. And there was no money in the budget. Indeed, the budget was overspent, but their transparency about it was so poor that nobody knew the extent to which it was overspent. So figures flying around at that point were between 6 billion and 36 billion, a ridiculous amount in terms of what could have been the over-expenditure. Anyway, there was nothing there, and what MOD used to do was just let the contract, find a little bit of money to start the project off, and then hope that Treasury would come to the rescue. That was called a culture of optimism. I prefer to call it a culture of recklessness and irresponsibility. 7 months into the contract, they found they didn't have the money, and so they paused the contract. But of course, they'd set up the infrastructure, they'd employed all sorts of people, and they had to keep all that going. They thought that the cost of pausing would save them some money in the short term, but would also cost about £900 million. 7 months later after that, they found it wasn't £900 million, it was £1.6 billion, simply by pausing the contract for 18 months. And that was just money thrown away. Then come 2010, we get a new government, and what do? They have a defence review, and they decide, we're going to be even cleverer, we're going to change the aircraft. So they changed the specification without any proper knowledge about the costs or actually even the technical know-how of what was implied. And then, surprise, surprise, 16 months later, they come back and say, it's all too expensive, we'll go back to the original project. That change of heart cost us another £74 million. And the other sort of great sheer mind-boggling costs come out of IT systems. I remember one afternoon when the Home Office told us that they just scrapped £1 billion worth of new IT systems on immigration, which made it even more difficult to count people in and count people out, and therefore helped to make the general public even more convinced that we weren't in control of immigration. The Nhs IT project was a massive project, which again was started under the Blair government, and the idea there was that things like your care records, wherever you were ill, whether it was in Carlisle or Cornwall, they could pick them up and without your having to give any history. So there'd be a universal system. They just hadn't thought it through. By the time we got to it, originally it was going to cost just over $2 billion. By 2011, it had gone up to $11.4 billion. And when we saw it got to it, they'd spent about half of that, over half, $6.4 billion. And the thing just wasn't working. And nothing had happened, and nobody had had any integrated care at all. They then said they were going to scrap it. It was a sort of coalition government commentary, really, on the overspending of the Labour government. So they scrapped it, but they couldn't scrap it because, of course, they were tied into contracts. So we are still today spending that money. We're not getting an integrated healthcare record system. We're not getting a national prescription service. And Jeremy Hunt, after they'd scrapped it, announced that he was going to ensure that the whole NHS was paperless by 2018, and the Treasury gave him another £1 billion. So that sheer mind-boggling waste was my first my first sort of reflection. The second is there is an attitude, and it saddens me to say this, that in the public sector, people too often feel they're spending other people's money. And therefore don't feel that sense of responsibility and accountability for it. I think that came out really strongly when we did the BBC payoffs issue. I've already talked about the Deputy Director General, George Entwistle, who was only in the job of Director General for 45 days, walked away with nearly £500,000 in redundancy payment. And a smaller, but actually really good example was we looked at this academy in Lambeth, Durand Academy, which had been created as an academy under Labour. It had an inspiring head. He had this great idea that he was going to build a boarding school for children from Lambeth, and I can't remember if it was Suffolk or Surrey. He therefore took over the playground, or half the estate of this school, and he built a leisure centre on there under a separate company, put himself in as chief executive. He was paying himself over £200,000 as head for a small primary school, and he took another £160,000 for running the leisure centre. So he was getting away with £400,000 a year. And when we saw him, by Googling around a little bit, we found, I hate to say that, by going on the internet a little while, we found that he'd actually opened a dating agency from this primary school, and we found this amazing photo of one of the people who were available to be dated, nude in a little bit of black, with a little bit of black underwear all over, covering her more precious private parts. So that other people's money was my second thing. The third thing is the government seems institutionally incapable of learning from past mistakes, and I think that is another really depressing finding. And part of that is because there's no structure to do that, so everybody works in silos, the departments are very separate, there is no strong centre, financial centre, where you could get some learning. The finance function doesn't in any way replicate the finance function you'd see in any complex industrial organisation or private sector organisation. And I think there are endless examples of this, but probably Private Finance Initiative, the PFIs, is the best example. We've now got well over 700 contracts in place. They're worth £39 billion, but we will have to pay over the 30 years that you have to pay back, because you borrow today, pay less today, and pay over time. We will have to pay £150 billion for those contracts that have been let. And they all, I mean, one of the problems is that for all the hospitals, for example, that we built, that was all fine at the time. But actually, we're now trying to get people out of hospitals, being cared for in the community with community care. So you're left with an asset that you no longer want. But the repayment on that asset is the first call on all your income. And there's no real learning about how to actually ensure you get the proper share of profits with the private sector when you do these. These contracts are sold on very, very quickly and make an arm and a leg for the companies that have learned how to exploit them. My next thing is really the lack of appropriate skills in modern government, and people often talk about this, but it remains true. It's always a work in progress. We never make much progress. And I think that's because civil service in the past, when I first started in my working career, my friends from university who went to the civil service went in to do policy advice and policy formulation. That's what it was all about. Today, it's much more about running services, particularly being able to manage these contracts with private and voluntary sector providers. And those skills are not there. And that old culture of actually focusing on policy formulation rather than program delivery still holds too strongly in too much of the civil service. So there are too few commercial skills, project management skills, finance, IT, all those things that you know that you want. And nobody stays in a job long enough. You get your promotion in the civil service by moving every couple of years. And of course, a lot of these projects are long-term projects and need you to stay there from beginning to end. And certainly on contracts, there is, if I can just talk a little bit about that, conscious of time, that is really worrying. What we're now getting with this massive, massive growth in privatisation is the emergence of new oligopolies. Atos, £1.4 billion of public sector money that it gets a year. Capita, 1.1 billion. Serco, 1.8 billion. G4S 0.7 billion. And if you think the total budget of DCMS is about 1.4, 1.5 billion, some of these private contractors now have a bigger public sector budget than some government departments. And whilst they do something as well, there have been a lot of very, very high-profile disasters. The tagging contract in MOJ, where Serco and G4S were found, 8 years after they'd started doing it, were found to be claiming not just the people who had left prison or had returned to prison and therefore didn't need to be tagged, people whose sentence has been expended, but they even found that they were charging for people who had died. I think the two that I would pull out, because they don't get quite so much publicity, is one that we uncovered of Serco's contract in Cornwall, where they were providing out-of-hours GP services in Cornwall. What they'd done was get the contract from a local cooperative simply by undercutting on price. They undercut on price, and then, of course, they didn't have the money to staff the contract up properly. So basically, they were simply not answering the phone in time, often not answering the phone at all, and not sending doctors out to see patients at the weekend when they were asked to do so. But they were lying about the data. And we found in a period of time, even after they knew that all eyes were on them, that there'd been what were called 2 data manipulations, I call them lies, 252 times about data there. What did Serco do? They sacked 2 employees. They ransacked the lockers to find out who had been the whistleblower, who had started the ball rolling on uncovering all this. And despite all those misdemeanors, the contract had been so appallingly badly written that they still got paid for the work they'd done, and they were still entitled to the bonuses under the contract. Another similar example was the interpreter's contract in the Ministry of Justice. The MOJ, after 2010, wanted to save money on the interpreter's contract, £18 million. And they thought that the interpreters had too generous a deal. But instead of managing that down, because they may have had a point, their only answer was to outsource it. And they gave the contract to a company on whom they did financial due diligence. And the financial due diligence showed that the contract should not, no contract not in excess of £1 million should be given to these particular people, ALS. They were a small regional contractor. In fact, they gave them a contract for £42 million, totally ignored their credit, but they ticked the box, they'd done it, so it didn't matter what it said, they'd actually done it. And then, of course, day one, it was chaos. They were supposed to provide 1,200 interpreters. There were only 280 provided. And we got the most incredible story, I think personified by one where the owner of a cat registered their pet as a feline language specialist. And that feline language specialist was asked to come in for a language test. And at the end of that fiasco, Capita was fined a mere £2,200. They bought out the other people. Just moving as quickly as I can, the other thing that I think I learned was how short-term the approach of government is. Electoral cycles, civil service, the length of time they spend in a job means people really don't look at the long-term implications. And as I'm in a university, I think HE student funding is an absolutely classic example of where we've got a completely unsustainable policy which at some point will collapse on us. An assessment in 2014 by Office of Budget Responsibility has said that by 2035, there will be £600 billion outstanding in student debt. That's about £330 billion in today's money. Now, we know that half of that will never be repaid, so it's a massive call on public expenditure over time. But that money, and I keep thinking I can't believe this, but I'm told it is absolutely true, the debt will peak at 8% of GDP. The other final 2 more things I want to say, and then I'm going to talk about tax, if I may, is there's no linking between accountability and responsibility in the way that too much of government works. Those who are responsible rarely find themselves accountable, and until we re-establish that link, I think we won't get very far in improving the quality of a service and the value for money. So my two examples there was that we were looking at an agricultural payment, European agricultural payment policy, the subsidies that you get from the European Union towards farming. And the woman who'd been in charge, the perm sec for 5 years, completely mucked it up. So people were being paid late, they weren't being paid at all, they were being paid the wrong amount of money. We were having to pay money back to Europe because we got it wrong. The woman who got it had gone off to become permanent secretary at the Home Office. And I thought it was ridiculous that we should interview the new permanent secretary there. And I have to say, it took me 3 goes and one of those famous order letters to say to her she really had to come back and account for what she had failed to do when she was permanent secretary at DEFRA, at the Department for Agriculture. And my other example is when they widened the M25, which was a completely terrible thing. They went for the wrong solution. They did it at the time of the financial crisis and did it under a PFI, so spent an arm and a leg on interest charges. They put a huge amount of money into consultants who advised them. I think it was about £8 million. When we wanted to interview the guy who was responsible for that fiasco, it turned out he'd gone to work for the consultants and was firmly ensconced in Spain and unavailable. So I think the old convention of civil servants being accountable to ministers who are accountable to Parliament is broke. It worked when Haldane invented it after the First World War, when there were only 28 civil servants in the Home Office. Today, despite the cuts, there are 28,000. And the idea that you can have that old ministerial accountability convention still working just isn't right. My final thing on that before I go to tax, I'm sorry about this, John, is that what came out of all this is that value for money ought to matter more to all politicians, and it doesn't. It should matter to both the right and the left. The right, obviously, because they want to cut spending, but the left, because we believe in the value of public expenditure, in transforming people's life chances and in equalizing life chances, it's really important that we can convince people to give of their hard-won earnings into the common pot for the common good. And it doesn't matter to politicians. It doesn't matter to ministers. They all want new initiatives. They don't really care about implementation. And actually, I'm not sure it matters enough to civil servants. And until we get value for money at the heart of what we do, I think we will carry on wasting billions. One of the important aspects of our work, and that does bring me to the tax, is the work that whistleblowers, investigative journalists do. And I think I'm the only person in the whole of the House of Commons who's got a good word to say about the journalists. But for me, they played a fantastically important role in bringing issues to me. And the area in which it mattered most was tax. So we stumbled on this issue. It was actually David Davis, the Tory MP, who was my predecessor, who was always really helpful to me in encouraging me to investigate new things, came up to me just after I'd been elected, and he pointed his finger at me and he said, "Margaret, Vodafone, you've got to look at Vodafone." And I hadn't a clue what he was talking about. How could the affairs of a private company have anything to do with the audit committee of a government? But of course it does, because it goes to the heart of the effectiveness and the efficiency of HMRC in collecting tax. And our very first story around this didn't come out of the great reports that the NAO do. It actually came out of a story in Private Eye. Private Eye was running a story on Goldman Sachs and how they'd got a sweetheart deal in a tax settlement they'd done with HMRC. And we had the head of tax giving evidence to us, and we asked him about it, as did the Treasury Select Committee. And in both committees, he said, I had nothing to do with this issue. And it's very frustrating because they all hide behind the confidentiality of taxpayers' interests, so there was nothing that we could do about it. So we left it. I felt frustrated. And then the next morning, I got a brown envelope, big brown, fat brown envelope. And actually, again, I thought this is too much. I was pretty busy. But my clerk said to me, look at it. And in that envelope was one sheet of paper. And it was the minutes of a meeting that had been held by the head of law in HMRC, in which they had talked about the Goldman Sachs deal, and he said that the head of tax had shaken hands on the deal. So in effect, the head of tax had misled Parliament, which is a very naughty thing to do. And the other thing he said was that the deal was unconscionable. So I thought that was pretty powerful stuff. We called back the head of tax, who refused to give us anything, hiding behind the confidentiality of taxpayers' interest. So we then called in the head of law, who just waffled away and said it couldn't tell us anything because it was his client's interest, and anyway, he wasn't allowed to tell us anything because of confidentiality of taxpayers' interest. At this point, my vice chair, Richard Bacon, who is a Tory MP from Norfolk, whispered into my ear, put him on oath. And I'd only been in the job for about 6 or 7 months, and I hadn't a clue about this. I said, I can't do that. I whispered back. He then said, no, you can. So I turned to the clerk and whispered to him, can I put him on oath? And he said, yes, you can. So I then said, go and get a Bible. And it took them 20 minutes to find a Bible. And when they did, we didn't get much more out of the witnesses, but within a few weeks, the head of tax had left the civil service. That was the first issue. But the issue became hugely important because the gap between what we should get and what we do get, that tax gap, HMRC put it at £34 billion. If you talk to tax campaigners, they talk about £120 billion. So even if you settle for somewhere in the middle, it's one heck of a lot of money. And we also know that every year, HMRC writes off £5 billion as uncollectible, and they hide in their accounts another £10 billion that they can't collect. And we also know that corporation, as a proportion of the total take of tax, is going down. And all our inquiries just struck a chord at a very hard time for most families here in this country. 85% of us pay our tax through PAYE. People are struggling to make ends meet, and they are seeing services cut in their community. So it simply offends their sense of fairness. And our whole agenda was not an anti-business agenda, it was really a pro-fairness agenda. Because if Starbucks doesn't pay its tax and therefore can undercut on price, it destroys the community-based coffee shops. If Amazon doesn't pay its tax and undercuts on price, it destroys all our high street bookshops. And Amazon was particularly offensive because when we looked at them, they had £4 billion of sales. Now, have I got time to do this, John? What I did with them, which was quite funny, I used to buy from Amazon, and if any of you still do, you shouldn't. You will see that you get these emails from them, which have amazon.co.uk about 5 times on the email. So when they were in front of us, I said, I usually buy from you. I think I'm buying from a British company. And he assured me that actually I was buying from Luxembourg. If you then do buy a good, it gets sent to you from a warehouse, probably in Slough, but certainly somewhere in the UK. It comes in a Royal Mail van, and it's got a stamp with the Queen's portrait on it. So you are, and you then get an invoice, also posted to you from Britain. So you entirely think you're doing deals with a British company, but you're not. You're doing deals with a Luxembourg-based company. They did £4 billion of sales in the UK in 2012. This was the year we looked at them. That year, they paid £2.4 million in corporation tax, and they received £2.5 million in grants for setting up even more of their warehouses where they employ people on appalling rates. So all these companies use our services. They want a healthy, well-educated workforce. They want people to be able to, they want to have the communications framework that we build for them. And when companies say to me, but we pay other taxes, I get really cross, because we all pay a range of taxes. That's how we get the income into the public purse. We pay our council tax, we pay VAT. We don't think that lets us off paying our income tax. And just because businesses pay taxes, that shouldn't let them off paying corporation tax. And I think there is a moral dimension to this debate. Tax professionals get cross with me. But if we could get the law right, we'd have done it. We'd have done it years ago. The reality is it's far too complex to get the law so that it's totally unambiguous and not open to interpretation. And if it is always going to be ambiguous, and if it is always open to interpretation, you have to have other values that come into how you decide how much tax you pay. And I think we all do make a compact as members of society to give according to our wealth into the common pot for the common good. And I think corporations should do the same. I just want to say one word about the Google tax and then some general things. The Google story, I think, illustrated everything very much. They say they're not selling in the UK. They say they're selling into the UK from Ireland. They say the IP, actually it isn't in America, as they sometimes claim, the IP that they use in England is paid for in Bermuda. So already there's a sort of dodge going on there. And I think the worst thing, when I've now watched Matt Britton 3 times, we had him twice, and then the Public Accounts Committee had him back, is his contemptuous attitude and the smug approach that he has, really. I don't think we should be worried about Europe and the power of the Germans over us. It's really the power of Google, Starbucks, Facebook, and all those people over us that have a much greater impact on our lives than other European nations. They are smug and they're contemptuous. And every pound they're let off is a pound that another taxpayer's got to pay, or it's a pound lost to the public purse. And I think the settlement just didn't pass the smell test. £130 million for 10 years, of which £18 million we now learn was interest charges. Eric Schmidt, who is the chairman, chief executive of Google, earned £165.5 million in 5 years. In 2014, he was paid £76 million, more than half of the tax they paid in 10 years. They claim to be the world's most valuable company. They're proud of the fact that they've cut their tax rate. Their earnings in 2015 in the UK were £7 billion, but we don't know their profits. The settlement that was made with HMRC brought in an extra £14 million on £7 billion turnover, bringing it to £46 million. And I think that settlement just smells. It offends most people's sense of fairness, and I think it's become a symbol of the breakdown of trust and confidence that we are all treated equally in front of the law. I haven't got time to go through all our other stories, but pulling out 2. One was the Jimmy Carr, the one where everybody from Jimmy Carr to Anne Robinson were involved in tax deals. We had, they called boutique advisors, these guys who give them the advice on entering these dodgy tax deals. We had them before us, and I was really worried about how to cope with this guy. I thought, what on earth should I ask him? So I asked him the very straight question, what is your business model? To which he replied, my business model is tax avoidance. And again, that showed such assurance that he felt able to say that. And I think my other great story about it was when we did a lot of work around tax reliefs. Every tax relief becomes an opportunity for tax avoidance. However, and we've got far too many of them. It's ridiculous in the UK. But we looked on the back of a story that the Times did. We looked at gift aid, which we all do. We all tick the gift aid box and think we're doing a good and right thing. But actually every year there are 300 cases that are investigated, therefore known by HMRC. And we came across this so-called charity, which was run by a couple of dodgy guys called NT Advisors, No Tax Advisors. They were based in a tax haven, I can't remember which one. They put £176 million through this charity. They gave one grant for £15,000 to a youth project. They claimed £46 million in gift aid tax relief. So what I do think about all this is that, and I've lost my pages now, sorry, is that we could do much better. I think the government is facing both ways on these things. It's creating tax haven conditions here in the UK by the changes it's bringing in. It only talks to the elite tax professionals. It doesn't talk to academics who might disagree with it. It doesn't talk to any of the charities who are involved in this issue. Everybody thinks that we're becoming a tax haven. There's Stephen Shea, who's the Harvard professor who gave evidence to the Congressional Committee on Apple, said, when I go to tax conferences now, I hear people talk about the UK as a tax haven. And I think we could do this. I think we could just call a halt on the idea that tax is so complicated that it's only an issue for the elite. I think if tax is something that belongs to us all, we should all understand it, and they should make it understandable to us. They've hidden behind that veil of secrecy for too long to stop us doing anything. I think we should have transparency. I can't for the life of me understand why publicly quoted companies, where we know the tax they pay, shouldn't also be telling us what the negotiations were to get there. When I ask people, why can't we have it? I've done it recently. What I got from an Oxford academic was, I wouldn't understand it if I got it. And what I got from a business leader was, but it's always been like this, why should we change it? So I would open up the dealings, particularly in the FTSE top 100. Of course, we've got to renegotiate the international rules. I think we've got to simplify the tax system. I think we have to reform HMRC, that they become much more assertive, aggressive, properly staffed, and really do chase taxpayers as hard as they do benefit scroungers. I don't think we should give contracts to people who don't pay their tax. And I think I would go further and create a new offence so that advisors, who are the ones who make so much money in this business, actually, if they give advice on a dodge that is then found to be illegal, that there is a sanction and a penalty on that. I babbled on too long. I'm taking this whole issue of tax avoidance into a new all-parliamentary party group, which we're going to carry on campaigning on the issue, because I think we've only just started it. I'm writing a book, which I hope you'll all enjoy reading, which is chronicling my years on PSC, kindly helped by King's College with a researcher. But they have been great years, and I feel really deeply, deeply privileged and very, very lucky. They have been, for me, the most rewarding years in my professional life. So what it's taught me is that life isn't a short sprint, for those of you that think. It is a long marathon. There's lots to do. And I think in the words of Martin Luther King, if I can end of that, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter, and we mustn't do that. Too long.
Questions? Who's first? Can I have a name? Can I have an institution as well, please?
Daisy Surgeon. I work in Parliament, but I used to work as a tax research fellow for Fabian Society, so I'm very excited to hear about your views. Given everything you've just said, why isn't there political consensus across left and right to get HMRC ministerial departmental representation? It makes no sense to me to put responsibility for paying tax on profit-making companies, which obviously assist them to make profit. Why aren't we putting more pressure? Surely it should be across the political divide to put more pressure on HMRC to have ministerial responsibility, and also to have boards that are represented by more than just PwC and EY advisors. Why don't we have civic society represented on those boards? I would have thought that's a cross-party political issue.
Because I think really this government, if I can say it about this government, I think it was probably true also of the coalition government, there's a difference between consulting your stakeholders, of whom the tax advisors and the whole tax industry is one, and being captured by your stakeholders. And I'm afraid this government has been captured by them. So they do only listen to those advisors. I think it's shocking. I have to say, the new man that they have now put in as head of tax, when he was in the private sector, I know it was 10 or 11 years ago, and that's what he pleads, but I don't think it's good enough. He said that tax is legalized extortion. So we've now got as head of tax somebody who wrote that. It's not that he said it off the cuff, he wrote it in an article in the FT a decade ago. So I think they're captured by them, they just listen to them, all their advice comes from this very narrow field. And there is a real problem with HMRC. It's a non-ministerial department, so it doesn't have a minister. They say they don't. It won't share information because of confidentiality of taxpayers' interest. And what I've always said is either we go for this opening up the FTSE top 100 and see whether chaos ensues. I don't think it would, but let's try it. Or what we could do is what we do around the security services, where we have across both houses of Parliament a parliamentary committee that oversees the security service. And that never leaks. Nobody ever hears anything about that. But it's a way of trying at least to start a proper accountability. At the moment, too many people have lost trust that we're all treated equally in front of the tax officers.
Thank you. There was somebody there. Yes, please.
John Newton, former parliamentary staff. I was just curious about your logic for the naming and shaming essentially of, say, Google, Starbucks, etc. Because you said earlier on in your piece that you were worried that these things were always going to be opaque and never going to be opened up, and therefore you had to try and bring a moral value judgment into it. But later on you came back to the idea that you wanted these things simplified and transparent. And I just wondered how you felt about the idea that by naming and shaming companies, you made it a moral judgment about their compliance rather than a structural and systemic problem with the way the tax code is constructed. And where the balance lies, both the publicity and also the debates around that.
Well, you may, but the moral judgment may help you get the institutional change, is really what I would argue back to you. And again, I think the government, just to come back, is absolutely, they do want to bring inward investment, and they think that tax competition is a way of doing that. I'm very sceptical. One of the things I'd love my all-party group to do is to look at whether actually tax competition is effective or isn't. Is it a myth or is it real? Because I think, people come and sort of headquarter here for all, or bring their business, partly it's a big market, we're the second biggest market for Google, partly because where we're placed in the time zone, partly because of our financial and legal services infrastructure, partly because it's a nice place in which to live. All those factors come into play. Now, tax may be a little factor, but I was very struck that Eric Schmidt, when he was interviewed after one of our hearings on Channel 4, one of his comments was, whatever you guys do on tax, we'll still be here. So I think actually naming and shaming won't damage, and we will still get companies. The final thing to say about this, one of my funny things was Starbucks, who obviously were deeply damaged by our hearing. They must have lost a massive market share. I never know how much. But their first thing was to ring me up, and I offered them a cup of House of Commons coffee. They offered me £20 million. I've never been offered £20 million before. And that was their contribution to tax. But more interestingly, they then rang me up a few months just before the 2015 election and said, we're going to headquarter here in the UK. I thought, great, that's partly because of the tax haven advantages that the government has created. So I said, well, how many people are you bringing, in my sceptical way? And there was a silence. And I said, well, 100. There was a silence. And I said, less than that? And it turned out that actually headquartering here in the UK was bringing 8 people here.
I've got 2 questions just here. Please, Jim.
And thank you for another wonderful run through all those stories. They tragically remind me of very many slightly humorous but deeply depressing conversations I've had in my career about many of the things that go wrong inside government. I thought one of your elements was really important, responsibility and accountability. And certainly throughout the work of the Institute, lack of responsibility, clear responsibility is very profound, especially in commercial areas around contracts. Sometimes it bleeds across, if I think about the academy chamber or the school you were talking about. I think that was the hearing we once had Chris Wormont in because Amos had an adverse opinion on the accounts of DFE.
Yeah.
Couldn't account to Parliament where the money had gone. Now, if you look at that, there are issues about timing and all sorts of things. Actually, the framework that ministers have set makes it incredibly difficult to actually track where money is going and have the normal control we expect from public private or voluntary sectors. And one other thing I just observed, in the system, we tend to find the system doesn't work quite often. There are loads of processes, but they don't actually achieve the outcome. Individuals within the system tend to make a very big difference. People who really care about what they're doing. So my question is actually, looking at your role and what you've done inside and from Parliament, you've made a huge difference to what's actually happening in the accountability of the government. What do you think about the role of Parliament and its responsibilities in taking forward, because some of this comes from Parliament legislation that has passed, or indeed scrutiny roles that may or may not be performed effectively? What do you think Parliament as a whole should be doing in response to the statement work you've set out so other people to hear?
Well, what I hope, and you sort of get the first indications that it's happening, is that people sort of see an alternative career from just climbing a greasy pole into ministerial office into actually being effective in Parliament. And I think it can be rewarding. You certainly serve your constituents well. I mean, I certainly felt, having taken on the BMP just before I took on this job, it was really important that I sort of reflected what my constituents wanted in the questions I asked. I think it really informed me how I approached it. So I think there are the indications that there are some people who are beginning to see it as an alternative career ladder. That's one. The other thing, which is much harder, is we as a political class are completely obsessed with new policies. We tried really, really hard to encourage other select committees, because we couldn't do the lot, to take some of the reports that were done by the National Audit Office and do the sort of exercise that we were doing in much greater depth through the departmental select committees. And I just never got that going, because everybody likes to think about the next policy, the new policy, the comments on that. And I think there's still a legacy of that in the civil service, so I think changing that's important. But I think if we can get this alternative career ladder going, which started because we had a coalition. I always think the coalition helped on that, because it broke down tribal party loyalties for a while. But it sort of seems a bit more embedded, helped by the fact that we've got elections. And then the final thing, which almost brings me back to the private sector, there's got to be greater transparency. The government talks about transparency, it doesn't actually deliver it. And if over half our services are now provided by private companies, and probably by the end of this Parliament, you're going to be talking about 60%, I would thought between 60 and 70%. The National Audit Office ought to have access to that, and where the public contracts are let, we ought to be able to FOI everything that's happening in those private companies so that they can be held properly to account.
Thank you. John?
John Tolson, Ministry of Defence. One of your conclusions in the first part of your talk was that the government was seen completely immune from learning from what was going on before. And if I've only permitted a big and small map, you mentioned the horror story of the aircraft carriers and the contract with that. If you go back just over 50 years, Harold Wilson's first government, for example, the same problem with 3 major aircraft projects. Now, in that 50 years, the 50 years curious about the time of the Ministry of Defence existence, if ever a department has been pinned against the wall, tried new initiatives, tried to reorganise its procurement better, it's been the Ministry of Defence. And self-evidently, it's not succeeded. Now, do you think that that is just something that there is a magic bullet here somewhere and we can get it right? Or is it that we just have to accept big procurement decisions, big procurement processes that we should then have to deal with a higher than normal rate of inflation for a thing? It's just something we've got to live with. And all that your committee can do is really move around the edges and point up the worst excesses.
I don't think that, but I'm always the eternal optimist. I think we can do very, very, very much better than we can. We won't get it right. I mean, some of these cutting-edge procurements, you're always going to, when you are trying completely new equipment, there's bound to be things go wrong, but not so much going on, not everything going on, which is where we are at the moment. And I think I've talked about a couple of things. I think it is the skills. We should look for a different skill set. We should reward a different skill set. I mean, for example, one of the things we found, nowadays people quite like being on the procurement side, so they quite like letting the contracts. No civil servant wants to monitor the contracts. And that's just as important. So changing that skill set. And I'm afraid in the MOD, they still change. I mean, I haven't got the figures on the top of my head, but the number of projects we went to where they changed the responsible official every couple of years is just absolutely horrific. So I think we can learn, and I don't think we can give up on it. I really don't. The final thing I was going to say, this starts at the top. And for writing my book, I've done a little bit of research on who's at the top of the civil service. Every single one of them, bar one, is an Oxbridge graduate. No offence to any Oxbridge graduates here. It's like a little Masonic lodge at the top there of the civil service. Sorry if I'm offending people around it, but that's what it feels like to me. And that culture comes down from there. So, you know, they're not valued. Even I remember one hearing where we asked two permanent secretaries, have you ever run a project? Neither of them had. So that whole culture from the top downwards is just too firmly embedded. And they're there because they know each other, they look after each other. If any of them get sacked, you see them jump up again in other roles with public appointments. And so I would do that whole skill set change, accountability change, keep people in their job and change the top. And anybody who comes in from the outside to the top, they get rid of them within 2, 3, 4 years. They never last. They never last.
You know, Margaret, that the whole idea of moving civil servants on every 2 years was actually a 1920s, 1930s policy of the Treasury, the Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, Sir Warren Fisher. He called it musical chairs. And the idea was you don't let a civil servant go native. Okay, yes. Rob.
In the age of austerity and more spending cuts to come, your portrait you paint of serial bundling, massive waste, no lessons really learned is obviously very depressing. Why is it, I mean, Parliament can't do anything. In your report you bang the drum, you have some effect in the sense of public opinion may be able to be brought to bear in some cases. But in most cases, public opinion isn't brought to bear, is it? I mean, is Parliament just impotent in this? I mean, nobody resigns, nobody's ever sacked for these incompetencies. You say no lessons are learned. What can be done to improve the situation? Is it just because you're a watchdog, you have the National Audit Office, but essentially, as you say, all you can do is call for witnesses, publish reports, you know, make a lot of noise? Is there nothing else that the public, why aren't the public getting engaged in it?
I think why are MPs not getting engaged, really? Why are MPs and ministers not getting more engaged is more. I think the public are completely engaged. From my email traffic, that's what's so crazy about this whole thing, that actually if you want to reconnect with where the public are at in politics, you take this value for money issue.
Why is it a big issue?
Because I think people just don't see it as a sort of sexy thing to do. The other thing to say is that we started a few, you know, I am Fabian by tradition, so we started a few things which I think have improved outcomes. So, you know, we had recall sessions which are now institutionalised in the Public Accounts Committee, so twice a year we'll call people back so if they haven't implemented our recommendations, we'll call them back to account. Hasn't worked everywhere, but it sort of has had a marginal impact and I think improved a little bit in some places. But we've just got to carry on. I mean, the public do absolutely care. They go ballistic. And they want MPs to ask those hard questions, which is why I think we were successful, because we were prepared to do that.
My question's actually quite similar. My name is Madison. I work in public communications, but I'm actually doing some research with King's College London at the moment into what sort of sources of external advice acting ministers. So at the start you spoke about how committees are kind of more backward looking and perhaps reflect.
Just ours.
Yeah, you spoke about that at the start. So my question really is, are select committees actually able to have an impact on ministers and current policy? And if not, should they? And what do you think they can do to achieve that end?
Well, I mean, on the margins, we still are run on a party basis. But I think the departmental select committees do have an impact on existing and future policy. Nobody is sufficiently engaged in the effectiveness of current expenditure. That's really the problem. That's the problem that we highlighted. And that's where we've just got to up our game.
Now, we normally finish at 1:45, but we were 5 minutes over, so there's so many hands here. So
take a few?
So do forgive me, please, Bill.
William Keegan, the Observer newspaper and the King's Policy Unit. First of all, before my question, aircraft carriers. When Michael Quinlan was working for Dennis Healy in 1964-70, he was going on about the need to get rid of aircraft carriers. Shortly before he died, a couple of years ago, he was writing letters to the Financial Times, got to get rid of these aircraft carriers, and they're still working. My question is, after that wonderful talk, what is your reaction, Margaret, to a Chancellor who says that by cutting the top rate of tax, he increases the yield dramatically?
Not true. Proven. I mean, you'll know better than I do on that one. Proven, but not true.
Okay, please.
Charlotte Rose, BBC, here in a really personal capacity. You said at the start that the one report that the committee couldn't agree with about the sale of the Royal Mail. What exactly was the nature of that disagreement?
I'm probably being really naughty on that. I'm not sure. I'm getting the no you're not allowed to say. That's my clerk telling me to shut up.
Shall I take
I think I've got to shut up.
Okay, well,
Read my book.
okay, yes, please.
How important would you say personality is as the chair of the Select Committee? And dealing with your politicians on it, because your committee now seems to have slightly fallen off the public agenda. Indeed, actually, Bernard Jenkins, as the chair of the Public Administration Committee, the kids' company stuff, seems to actually fall the public imagination and the media also. So it's really how important that is.
Okay, another question there.
Tom Robinson, Officer Jonathan Reynolds. I just want to jump in on what that gentleman said, because I see you as part of the school of Gwyneth Dunwoody and her
I'm not going to die yet.
If you remember that's how she dealt with Railtrack and how you dealt with ATOS, you know, these are remarkable examples. And what that gentleman's just said over there about personality leads on to my question. What attributes do we need in the agency of the next Gwyneth Dunwoody or the next Margaret Hodge to lead another fantastic school committee?
Thank you very much. Yep.
Susanna, very important as well. We recently had an NAO report which said effectively civil servants are not as good now at challenging ministers. They're not incentivised to challenge ministers. There's not as many letters of direction. I wonder if you could reflect on, do you think that's true in your career in government and your career as a president?
Okay, right at the very back.
I spent 15 years of my professional life working with consultancy, doing business cases in central departments, trying to bring the
For whom were you working?
various consultancies, small.
Yeah, one of the, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah. When we even tried to teach the MOD value for money. And it was impossible, for a simple political reason, that it was outside the budgets. And nobody wants that time frame to be taken into consideration. We did the initial business case reward. We gave a presentation to the Home Secretary at the time. He decided to ignore the risk register. And that set, well, we lost the job to a big consultancy, but that set the whole term. So this is endemic. Nobody understands value for money. It is not politically acceptable in the current environment. And my question is, when I watched the videos of the Defence Select, the EAC, and what do you need, I think, do you think you need stronger sanctions for these companies? Because the PFI is a complete scam, and the government says we're getting assets off the balance sheet.
Thank you. Have I missed anyone here? Right here, please.
Sean Finham, businessman. I was wondering if any good news ever came out of the asset. I know the NAO a number of reports pointing out good projects that, as your media story earlier, never got reported. And you know, we do kind of rely on business to employ people, and therefore, and civil servants also talk about surviving the PAC. And I think a culture that is perhaps a little more balanced might encourage the outcomes you seek.
Okay, I've got two last questions. One down here.
David Henke, freelance journalist. Can I ask you, Margaret, what do you think are the three biggest impediments to you getting things done? I'm thinking the BBC, for instance, still having a say, or trying to have a say in what can be investigated by the National Audit Office. And actually the Financial Conduct Authority at the moment using an EU directive to deny documents about from companies to actually Parliament and the Auditor General, for example.
Thank you very much. Last question, Mike.
Dominic, from Parliament. What ability do you think that ministers have to set the kind of tone of value for money in their department?
Say that again?
Do you think ministers can set the tone of how much value for money they civil servants get?
No.
Well, that should be fairly easy for you, Margaret.
I mean, let me say the first thing about, we were a fantastic team. It wasn't just, we were really, in our big hearings, we worked as a team. And when I I never watched myself on television, but in writing this book, I've looked at I've gone back to one or two of the hearings. And what sort of struck me about it was that how well we worked. Although we never agreed about anything, on these issues we worked really, really effectively as a team. And I think there's a little bit about being a woman, dare I say, in the chair. And I did spend a lot of time making sure that everybody felt included and important and valued as a member of the team. And I've been succeeded by a woman, so I hope that she'll sort of also, if everything develop, into a strong chair. I think this issue about quite a lot of these come together. I think it's outrageous that civil servants don't challenge ministers. I can't remember who raised this question, but don't challenge ministers more. I think it is just outrageous. And I'd say that in a completely non-partisan way. If you see that something is daft, or hasn't been thought through, or has been tried before and failed, you should force the minister publicly to account for going down that route and trying. Universal credit is probably the best example of that. A policy that is probably a non-contentious policy, but really tough to do, and nobody challenged the ministers. So it always brings me back to these same things. That's why the doctrine of ministerial accountability is broke. And that's why we have to look, and I know it's really hard, and I haven't got the answers to what should replace it, but if you simply carry on with this tradition of civil servants only being accountable to their minister, who is then accountable to Parliament, you'll never break that logjam. You've got to open that whole system to public health. Now, if you do, immediately, ministers will say that their policy advice will get challenged. Well, they will. I don't think that's a bad thing. Why do we worry about that? Because the more public challenge there is to policy, the greater the likelihood that you're going to get it right first time and not ignore risk registers. So I think it comes back always to this issue about accountability and all that. Balanced, should we be more balanced? Inevitably, our job, you know, a lot of our work came off the back of reports, which on the whole looked at things that went wrong. We did do good reports. I introduced, in the attempt to try and up the good news, we introduced a civil service award for the best report, Public Accounts Committee report every year. And, you know, we did try and get coverage for our good report. One of our media, it's just impossible. You try and get anybody to do it. But what do you think about MPs? You think they're all on the tape. You know, there's probably a couple of us who were, but because you only hear about those, you think we're all in the same thing. And all businesses are corrupt. They're not all, actually most of them are not paying their tax, the big ones, but nevertheless, the SMEs certainly are being hounded for theirs. So we did try. It's just, in a sense, it's not a question to me. It's a question much more, I think, to 24/7 and probably to you. What do you want to read and what do you want to see? What are the three big impediments to make? I think it's openness. I mean, I think this issue about certainly, you know, we ought to be able to see what goes on in these private companies. It was so frustrating on the work programme because we knew that it wasn't value for money. I knew from my constituency it was a complete rip-off. I still think the whole programme was and is a rip-off. But because it was such a total policy for the government, they simply refused to release the data on it to enable us to interrogate the outcomes and see whether or not it was right. So I think openness is good. And the other thing, I'm just going to end with this story about what stopped us. There was a point with tax where our concern was that HMRC, unaccountable, was doing sweetheart deals with certain people. They denied it, and in fact we had an HMRC would always come in their evidence and say they couldn't share anything with us because of the confidential taxpayers' interest. The NAO then did a report led by a judge who happened to be a tax judge, and one of my furies in this whole is the QCs who sign off a lot of these deals and therefore get the advisors feel covered by a QC opinion and can go off and sell it, market it. But the tax, because he'd been a tax specialist all his life, he came back with a sort of, this is all okay, and I just didn't believe him. I mean, all I can tell you is I didn't believe him. Everybody says to me, he's a really good QC, he's a really good High Court judge. You know, he must know what it's about. I just didn't believe it. So, both HMRC and NAO have two duties. They have a duty of confidentiality to taxpayers' interest, and they have a duty to help assist Parliament. And those two duties conflict, and they always chose to give precedence to their duty to protect confidentiality to taxpayers' interests. I said, but you've got this other duty. I wanted to test it. They went off and got QC's opinion, telling them they couldn't tell us anything. So I said, well, I'd like us, as the PAC, to go off and get our opinion, to see whether or not actually they shouldn't be given opening up. And what I was told was in the £200 million budget, which I never got my fingers on actually, which is the House of Parliament budget, we spent £200 million, there wasn't any money left that could help us go off and get a legal opinion to see whether or not, in that conflict of duties, the precedent should be given to assisting Parliament. So there's a little bit of support to select committees there, which might have helped us, again, open up to public access. It's all about opening it up. The more you open up, the better value you'll get.
Again, wow. So that brings us to an end of Strand Group 10. Strand Group 11, coming in a month's time, we'll see David Willits talk about 100 years of government science policy lessons for the future. Do join us for a drink, just around the corner there, and would you join me in thanking, after a barnstormer, Dame Margaret Hodge.